Welcome to Religion Wise. I'm your host, Chip Gruen. I'm excited to welcome today's guest, Maurice Bloem, who serves as the president and CEO of the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities. He's an absolute pleasure to talk to, and I think you'll enjoy listening to my conversation with him. His career is as illustrious as it is interesting to hear about. As you'll hear, Maurice begins the conversation by talking about what he calls his resume of failures. Given all that he's accomplished, this might seem surprising, but it sets the tone for a conversation about learning, humility, and inner development. And all of this marks his work. What I think is most important for our project here on Religion Wise is to hear his orientation and JLI's orientation to religion in humanitarian and development work. He trained in the Netherlands as an anthropologist, but then went on to work for the Church World Service in Indonesia for about a decade, including their response to the 2004 tsunami, which just absolutely devastated that area. One of the things you might listen for is the relationship that he sees between secular development organizations, that is, both governments and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and religious communities. Maurice describes himself as not particularly religious, but he really understands, nevertheless, how religion is important to the vast majority of people we share this earth with. If you try to help a community while cutting out its deeply rooted religious institutions and leaders, you disadvantage yourself, not only for understanding the worldview, but also for understanding the mechanisms that get things done in those places where religion is held so deeply. This is the core of what JLI does. It makes the case that development institutions can't achieve their goals, or at least can't achieve them most effectively, without engaging local religious communities. The organization works with groups like World Vision, Islamic Relief, UNICEF, and others to build evidence for what faith communities actually contribute to their shared humanitarian and development outcomes. The other thing I want to mention is how Maurice really does walk the walk of the work that he does. He's passionate about the inner development goals, or IDGs as he calls them. These are about cultivating your best self and showing up for the people around you. He's very thoughtful about his own development and how that can aid the project of helping others. Finally, he hosts his own podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen, which is really worth checking out. He mentions it here, and we'll put the link in the show notes. It emerges from his personal practice of walking 100 miles in a single week, and he's done some form of this since 2011. On these walks, he talks to people and tries to understand them, taking very literally the idea of walking in somebody else's shoes. He uses what the ancients call a peripatetic style, learning through walking, being mindful, staying embodied, using that not only to raise awareness, but also as a personal practice, and maybe even what we might call a devotional practice. So with all that in mind, here's my conversation with Maurice Bloem. I hope you enjoy it. Maurice Bloem, thanks for coming on Religion Wise. This is great.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chip, for having me. I mean, for me, it's as you know, I'm sitting now. I feel that I'm sitting on the other side of the table now. I interviewed you actually for my podcast, Walk, Talk, Listen. Shameless self-promotion here, and definitely, I would invite the listeners of your podcast to check that episode out because I really enjoyed it. It's strange for me to be on this side of the. I'm better. I think I'm better in asking questions than answering them. So I'm a little bit nervous in that regard. And then I think also I've become, I don't know how you think about it, but I've become a better listener as a result of making podcasts. Okay, many still think, including myself, that I'm a continuous work in progress, but I do think that I'm getting better at it. And listening is really something that we should all do as humanity more. We are so quickly with, coming up with an answer. Oh, I know where Chip is going with this and I don't like it, so quickly. But if we would really listen, then very often we would realize that, hey, there is something that I can learn something from, or hey, I did not expect that from this person. So there is a possibility for dialogue here, and we lack that in this world, known to be a polycrisis world where so much is going on and a lot of polarization is going on. And I think, to get to a solution or a better place, listening is maybe number one thing that we need to do. So, happy to be here, Chip.
Well, it's a shame that you feel out of place on that side of the microphone because your career trajectory is so interesting. I mean, some of these stories we've talked about before. Some of them I'm learning about for the first time. So I'm really excited to get into that. So let's just start with that trajectory as a whole. So you hail from the Netherlands, studied anthropology, and then embarked on your career in humanitarian work. Can you talk about the connections between that educational and professional trajectory? How did you get here where you are now?
Yeah. And this is one of the questions that you sent to me, to talk about this. And I was thinking about it, because then you look maybe at your resume and think, oh, what have I done, and how did I ultimately get here, right? And then I was listening last week to another podcast, and they were referring to a resume as well, a CV as well, but a CV of failures. And as far as my knowledge goes, which they mentioned also in that particular Dutch podcast, Melanie Steffen in Nature in 2010 came up with that concept in terms of the CV of failures. And because she did not get a proposal, which we all have gone through, right? And so I thought, in a way, my resume of failures would tell my story much better than my list of successes. And which is also interesting and that's maybe because I'm anthropologist. I always look at, culturally, how do people react at certain stories. And one of the stories of my resume of failures or of successes is that, I did my last class of my high school twice. So I failed the first time. So when I tell about this in the US, they look at me like, how did you do that? That's not possible. While in the Dutch system, actually, to do your class one again, or two or three, that's not crazy. I mean, sometimes, children are not ready for, and they let them play more. In my case, it had to do with, I got into a moped accident. And so I was out for a couple of months, due to meniscus injury as well as a concussion. And so, I failed the first time for the last year. And then the second time, I almost failed again. So why is that, Maurice? So, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, I mean, she was successful the first time. So she was gone. My friends were gone. And so I was most of the time with her. Or if I was not with her, I was writing poems for her. So, so, so so you think about this, right? It's at that time, it did not feel like a success story. I was also not bothered by it, but other people saying to you, and especially sometimes when you tell that in the context in the US, you did it twice. How is that possible? And now you are the CEO and president of an organization. How is that possible? But if I look back at it, those moments shaped really my life and what I'm about. The particular moped accident did result in, I had a couple of things that I wanted to do after my high school. 5 things actually: travel, music, soccer, study medicine. And then, music and soccer were not possible anymore, because for, music, I was a drummer, so you had to be able to play almost 24/7, right? With your knees, it was not possible. Soccer is also out. So then suddenly, instead of 5 choices, you have 2 left, and that's medicine or travel. And, my brother-in-law is a medical doctor. My brother was a medical doctor. And I always had seen those books, in their rooms. They were very thick books. And then I realized when I did some more research that you had to memorize many of those by heart. And I thought, that's not my strength. You know what? I want to travel. And so how can you travel? And that's how I ended up with anthropology. So yeah, nothing. I mean, I'm always intrigued by students that I work with now. They know already where they want to go. I never had that. It was not until I went to do my field work in Indonesia, in the Indonesian Borneo, when I lived among Dayak communities together with Catholic priests, that I kind of slowly started to feel like, oh, okay, this is the type of environment where I would like to work. I was moved to see how people, you know, went from one world to the other, from traditional way of lives to modern systems, from Christianity, because in Indonesia, you have to choose one of the five religions, main religions like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. And then they will still continue with the indigenous practices. So, that experience definitely changed me. It made me realize that I like that bridge building, translating, trying to connect things. And maybe that has to do with my own identity. I'm a Eurasian. I have, I'm rooted in colonialism because of, but I'm also, in my body is also be the colonized person. So slave, how do you say that? Owner. That's part of who I am. That's part of my ancestors. So maybe that also has to do with those connections that I'm searching for and that I'm intrigued by. And because I will look back at my resume of failures. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. So
Yeah. No, I mean it's funny you talk about both, like not knowing where you're going necessarily, unlike many students today, and then the idea that you can taste failure and it is not fatal. Like those are gifts. Both of those are gifts.
hmm,
And I wonder if we're not affording our students, we're not doing our students a disservice by not offering them the same gifts, right? That failure
hmm.
is sometimes okay, and you don't need to know where you're going and what you're doing.
Yeah, and sorry, Chip. What I've seen, because you asked me, certain things in the beginning before we started recording. What do you see happening in the States? Because I live here now, right? For around 16 years, I've lived in Bangladesh for around 7, in Indonesia for 10, and I have to think about 25 years or so in the Netherlands, which is I still consider my home country. So, but I've seen a lot of different contexts and how people react and what is necessary. And you see, that parents with their children, they're so worried about what would happen about life. And I think and it's so weird because if you look at data, I think in the Nordic countries, they let their children play, right? They're not concerned about tests, and those children are doing pretty well, if not better. And you look at well-being; the Nordic countries are doing very well, actually, on those indicators as well. So, if you know all those data, why are we still continuing to push for growth? And we will talk hopefully later a little bit about sustainable development goals.
Yes.
Why have we have created this world that's not in balance, where we're struggling and where we should be concerned about the future of it and also for our great rich children. Why are we then still pushing for that? And why are we not looking for more harmony and balance? Where does that come from? Um, so yeah, it's definitely concerning, the world that we have created.
So I want to jump into two particular points in your development. I mean, one, obviously, we'll get to your work now at the Joint Learning Initiative, but I want to go back about 20 years. You mentioned that you'd been a long time in Indonesia, and in fact, you spent years working for the Church World Service in Indonesia, including their response to the 2004 tsunami. Can you talk about that I mean, I read that. I didn't know that about you, and I read that about you, and I thought,
Hmm.
gosh, I mean, horrible, like one of the single most horrible days. And in my 50 years of living, just seeing the sheer loss of life, and you were here at the center of it. Um, what what was that like? How did you feel the Church World Service responded to that? Like, what were you called on to be at that particular point?
Yeah, I mean, the time that uh, I, you know, that I lived and worked in Indonesia was extremely important for so many ways, right? Personally, Indonesia was also important. My parents were born and raised there, right? They were also they are also Eurasians. They were there in Indonesia when it was still a colony of the Netherlands, in camps as a result of World War II. Japan, did similar things like Germany in other parts of the world. So both had been in camps. They, ultimately they are freed, and then they think we go back to our lives. But Indonesia calls itself independent, and then my parents had to make a choice: staying there, become Indonesians, and or going to the Netherlands and start their life there, although they had never lived there. They had a quick conversation, arguments. My father wanted to stay, my mother wanted to go. My mother won the argument, and as a result, all the children are born and raised in in the Netherlands. So, but I always heard the stories about Indonesia, and then I went there as a child for vacation. I already told you that anthropological fieldwork I had done in Indonesia. And then after 7 years of Bangladesh, I had the opportunity to start working in Indonesia, which was great. And because for me, it was like, oh, maybe I go home. I realized, was not my home, because it was, as a mixed, it was the country of my parents, but it had also changed, and it was definitely not my country. And I loved it, but it was not my country. Anyway, so after Bangladesh, I was kind of ready for, we go to a country now where I can do development work, where, in contrast to Bangladesh, where we had always floodings and typhoons or whatever, it was very much dominated by humanitarian and emergency response stuff. In Indonesia, I have done more humanitarian stuff than in Bangladesh as a result of civil strife, as a result of the tsunami, as you mentioned. So, and yes, I have had experienced many different disasters in Bangladesh, but never something of the magnitude what I've seen the devastation of after the tsunami in Indonesia. If you talk about total flatland, that's what I saw there, flatland. Everything destroyed except maybe a mosque still standing. I had staff members of Church World Service, because we had, although we were an American US NGO, we had maybe 2 or 3 foreigners. The rest was Indonesian colleagues. So I had staff members who had lost, 10, 12 of their family members as a result of the tsunami. We had NGO partners who had lost many family members. Everything, the projects. So it was terrible, as you mentioned. However, what I also realized there when I was looking and talking and listening to my colleagues as well as to our local partners is that the enormous resilience, which is often already present locally, really long before that whole international system catches up. And what happened on the good side was that everybody wanted to go to Indonesia, Thailand, because it was all had been on television, right? So everybody wanted to help, but also organizations came in that had never worked in Indonesia, and they started building houses that people didn't want to live in. And I remember that we had another system. We were already working in Indonesia before the tsunami, and we, together with the local community, we started building houses, much more use of local materials, local carpenters, so to get their jobs back, to get um, those type of things. While we were criticized for going so slow by outside assessment teams, And they said, look at the other NGOs, and they've built these houses, but those houses were not used. Why not? Because they were built in certain times at places where um, people had died, and where not the right ceremonies were used before you start, using the land again. And all those things because we were working so closely with the local population, we had taken care of. And to be honest, I would have lived in some of those houses that were built by these foreign, the international, the outsiders, let's call them for the moment. But no, those houses didn't work for the local population. So, but the enormous pressure that we were on, because you're not spent enough money, and you need to go faster. While if you ask, to the local population until today, and you ask them how was it to work with church world service, well, you have to say CWS, it's the abbreviation in Indonesian. They like how we worked with them. The water pumps that we made together with them are still being used. The houses that we built are still standing, because we also built houses that were earthquake resistant. So we used the local carpenters, and we did come up with the expertise and saying, yes, but if you make this roof a little bit different, then the next time it will not crack. So there was this combination of not romanticizing, everything that is done at the local level, but taking it seriously, as well as there is always some expertise that you can use from outside as well. And how do you find that balance and be open and listen to what is needed at a particular point in time. The other thing, what I would like to mention in terms of my personal growth, because we're talking about the resume of failures as well. I started it is when you, if I look at my whole career, what the tsunami did was also generate quite a lot of money, which was unheard of. Normally, when you have an appeal, you're happy that you get 10% of the, what you actually need. But our appeal was fully funded and more, so money was not a problem. So then you have, as the responsible person, you have a lot of money to your disposal. And then I think in my career was definitely moments where I thought, oh, this is all due to me. I've been such a great director or manager, and then things happen. Of course, then suddenly you, because of your, or partly because of your attitude, you run into walls and into problems, and then when I analyze it back, you understand how that happened. So you know what I started to learn there is that there is a continuously need to work on your humility, on your empathy, on your listening. And what I like is the inner development goals that have been developed recently, that if you want to change systems and structures, you also need to continuously develop and strengthen your inner development of yourself and your community. And I compare it, and other people have compared that with muscles. If you not train certain muscles, if you don't train your muscle of humility or empathy, you think that you still have it, but I cannot even see my feet anymore. So because the belly is in the way, right? So you need to train. You need to continuously train your muscles, your inner muscles, your outer muscles. So yeah, there are so many lessons from living and working with great folks in Indonesia, and it was awesome time. And also, Chip, for me, the kind of was really thankful for is that my parents left Indonesia with a lot of fear. They didn't want to return because they had left a country that was in war, and they were really afraid. And then when I lived there and my brother also lived there at the time, they realized, oh, that's all gone. It's forgiven and we can live here. I've never seen my dad is as happy as he was when he lived for a couple of months in a year with us. and with his grandchildren. But most of the time he was outside talking with the local population and eating a lot of the Indonesian food that you can just get on the street. That's what I miss. If you ask me, what do you miss? Well, I miss the food at any time of the day, good food. Yeah, no, thanks for reminding me about Indonesia. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, so I want to sort of, it seems to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but your career and your career trajectory is really this balancing act between valuing the local, valuing, the context of the places you're working, but on the other hand, being connected to these large organizations, being connected to NGOs, right? And as you've just indicated, right, that there's something of a balance there, that there's something that can be gained from each side. So you later represented the Church World Service at the United Nations. I mean, we can't talk about a larger, more significant, right, organization that does this work than that. And much of their international development work is organized around the Sustainable Development Goals. And that exposure, right, really shapes the framework that you work in, shapes how you think about faith-based actors, et cetera. What did the time at the UN and in particular sort of the exposure to those sustainable development goals, how did that affect you in the work that you did and you continue to do?
Yeah, no, and thanks for that question, because I mean, there were things that I'm proud of, and there were also a lot of frustrations as well. But I think why I'm always try to talk about the sustainable development goals is not that it is perfect, but I think it gave the world a shared language. It was an improvement on the goals that we had developed, of the world had developed before that, which was much more the result of inside of a room. Some people came up with the Millennium Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a result of more participation and more perspectives. That's why maybe they're also too many. I mean, there are 17, so maybe you should focus on 4 or 5. But at least it's an attempt to come up with shared language and a framework that if you really look at it, that many actors around the world rally around. And so that matters. And unfortunately, not all countries are doing equally their best to contribute to those goals, but they should, I think. I mean, we are all interconnected at the end of the day. You cannot only think that your country is the most important. Ultimately, you will be affected somehow, because you cannot live in isolation anymore. That's the world that we have. But the framework, as I mentioned, really is building strong on system changes and goals and structures. And I think what it forgot is to pay attention to that inner relational, cultural dimensions that shape whether change is really possible or not. So, and I think there, what I realize is that a lot of faith-based organizations, faith-based actors, should, in principle, be, you know, very well positioned to try to be that bridge, to ensure that there is a balance between the outer and the inner. That you need to, reminding people that you need to work on yourself and your community on things like empathy, creative thinking, and that those are an important part if you look at the necessary system changes that we need as a world. Because we have created a world that is based on growth instead of looking at balance, at its sustainability and being just. So yeah, you mentioned Church World Service. I'm not a very religious person, actually. I'm from the Netherlands, so most of folks are very they have an allergy in talking, even using the word religion, and we're not the only European country that has that. So that's how I grew up. I was raised Catholic, but the church was not very important. And my father went to church. My mom thought it was not necessary. But also because of my in-laws, I ended up with Church World Service, which is a Protestant organization, right? And then you start reading. You need to start much more reading. I mean, for one, that my father-in-law who had worked for World Council of Churches for part of his career, couldn't believe that they had hired me for church world service. Well, he said, "You don't know anything." So about and we had very good conversations, and I think I've learned a lot from him, and I think there's a lot of respect now. And I'm the funny thing is that I'm the only person in the family that kind of went in his footsteps, into his work, because he was the emergency response person of the World Council of Churches. Anyway, so religion is not very important, or church is not very important for me. But as an anthropologist, I've always seen, the importance of religion and spirituality in the different countries and the people that I've met. So I always had admiration, and I wanted to work for an organization that had impact. And then I thought, then you need to work for a faith-based organization, because if 70 to 80% of the people in the world consider him or herself themselves to be part of a religion, then if you want to have change, if you want to, push forward and have an impact, you need to work for a faith-based organization. So that is what I've been doing until recently. JLI is more a neutral organization in a sense that we work with all kinds of faith partners, but the body itself is not secular, but not faith-based. I mean, we work in the faith-based space, but over time, I realized this has a big impact. I need to understand more. But why are many of those faith-based organizations not playing the real faith-based role? And what I mean with that is, at a certain moment, I did not see the difference between, a world vision or a care. And so, why not? Because it's I'm not talking about convincing somebody else that you need to take their religion, but giving more attention to the fact that when you work in Indonesia or you work in Kenya, people, their spirituality, their religion is part of who they are and how they act and what they do. So you need to keep that into account. And you cannot say it's not important. We focus on other things. It's an important part of their lives. I mean, similarly, going back to that example that I gave you in terms of building the houses, right? Is paying proper attention to what is important for the people you work with. And so I'm so happy that I landed ultimately after having worked for Church World Service for 26 years with JLI, because for me, in a way, I'm home in the sense that, as an anthropologist, I started in working for the university, and then I slowly got into the NGO world, and JLI brings everything together again. I work with academics, pre-academics, and practitioners, in the space of religion and development, where we're trying to figure out, okay, what is that added value of faith-based organizations? What is evidence? From whose point of view is something considered to be evidence? Can we include more voices while we co-create, new findings where we really learn mutually, where we are in dialogue? And that's something that JLI has been trying to do from the beginning. We're trying to push that further to the next step. And I think it's more important than ever in this polarized world that is happening. So I'm really thrilled and thankful that I'm given this opportunity to work with a great team, but also work with the community. It was interesting when I had never heard about JLI, which is so strange because, Church World Service should have been aware of JLI, but we were not. But then ultimately, when we got a new CEO, Rick Santos, who had been the chair of JLI's board at a certain moment, when he asked me to represent Church World Service at JLI, and then I was asked, the long story short, I was asked to help them out 2 days a week because they did not have a CEO. And the first thing I did was trying to talk with people who were member or part of JLI. And what struck me is they all spoke about we at JLI. They, even if they worked for Islamic Relief or World Vision or, any of the other organizations, they talked about we. And I said, wow. So this sense of community is really core here. So so it was so important, and maybe all the member organizations did not even realize that they spoke like that. But I really think that, so if you think about JLI, it's a relatively small organization. It doesn't have a lot of people on the payroll, but the community is enormous, and the contributions of each one of them is so important and great. Um, and so I mean, sometimes organizations are kind of how many reports did you bring out, and only one report this year. But I think, and that's what we're trying to emphasize. So we made in 2022 the state of the evidence report, and very important and very good. But for me, when I looked at everything that was happening, I thought the next step needs to be a little bit different in terms of paying more attention to the process. And that doesn't mean that we did not pay attention to the process before, but in terms of the balance a little bit more to process. So we came up with the state of the evidence navigator. So it's a living space where knowledge can evolve, where people can contribute, and where learning is ongoing, where ultimately, again, as I said, the output is not that important, but the ecosystem that you try to build or that you have built. And then outside of the navigator, we are also trying to invest in something that we call the IDG and faith pathway. So it's the inner development goals, but from a faith perspective. How does being show up in Buddhism or in Islam? um, and then you're looking at things like hope and resilience, and then you realize that not in every context there is even a word for resilience. How is that? So what is an equivalent then? Or sometimes you talk with somebody else and you think you're talking about the same thing, but actually the definition is in a particular context something totally different. So we are working on those type of things, and we're trying to create that platform or a table where more people can sit and share their knowledge. And so it's really, as I said, a shift from a knowledge producer to being a learning ecosystem, and that those changes, trying to work on that is not easy, I have to say, because as I mentioned, it's a great community of academics, pre-academics, and practitioners, but they all have their own opinions as well, which is great. It makes the beauty of it, but also is sometimes makes that you have the rubbing of, what one person might consider research, and for another person that's not research. So we have some interesting things going on there. So
No, it's interesting to hear you talk about this because I'm trained in religious studies, which
mhm,
of course anthropology is one of the major disciplines that influences the growth and development of religion studies. So hearing you talk as trained as an anthropologist, there are so many things that resonate with me. I just want to underline the idea that all conversations that involve religion don't have to be religious conversations, right?
mm,
That is
mhm,
so hard for people to understand, right? That you can say
yep,
about yourself that you're not quite a secular person, but at the same time not super invested in church structure or organization, but that you appreciate that differing worldviews lead people to live
mm,
in different symbolic worlds, and that has real world effects that we need to pay attention to. It's just music to my ears. It's so wonderful to hear you talk about that
no,
because it seems, I mean, I think to both of us, it seems like a really natural place to land, but so much of the world doesn't see it that way, doesn't understand it that way,
mm,
right? It's not about religion, it's about politics, it's about power, it's about any number of other these things, right? But if, like you say, 80% of the world sort of believes that the motivating factor in their life is religious identity, and that guides their belief and practice, like maybe we should pay attention to them, right? And
No, absolutely. And I realized I started talking about, I'm not that religious, and for sure not in the beginning. I come from the Netherlands. I did not finish that off, because what I did, what did happen to me over time, because I have so much admiration for, I've worked in church world service, and many of my colleagues, their calling, right? That's how they call it. First, I didn't understand what that was. What is that calling? Um, I'm fascinated by that, and I see how driven they are. It's beautiful and powerful, and how it helps people to keep on going during difficult times. So they are. I've been right after a tsunami or a flood or the situation that many of the people around the world are in. Religious communities, they are incredibly powerful forces for good, and they provide meaning, belonging, resilience, and um, often also practical support in very difficult circumstances. So I've gained a lot of admiration for its role. At the same time, we also need to acknowledge that they can and have contributed to exclusion, inequality, or even harm. So I think the question is not if religion is good or bad. I think the question is how we engage with it responsibly. So at JLI, we approach this with humility, or try to approach this with humility and openness, recognizing both the potential as well as the risks, and working with partners who are committed to really this inclusive, just, and life affirming approaches. And that's so that keeps me going, even though you know so many people at the moment are living in very difficult circumstances. um yeah.
so I want to chase down something that I've thought about a lot. And this isn't the specter of the religious organization that could potentially cause exclusion or harm, but it's a different kind of risk that I'd like you to think about with me. And that is that there's a certain way of thinking about the state, about government, that it has kind of responsibilities towards its people, right? And particularly you coming from the Netherlands and thinking about Northern Europe generally, right? That there has traditionally been a sense that health and welfare and basic human needs and basic human dignity, that there's a role for the state to play in making sure that people don't fall through those cracks. I'm sorry to say, not quite as strong a tradition of that in the U.S., but some. And one of the things that has happened, because the safety net is so porous in places in the United States, let's say, is that there becomes a reliance on NGOs, on faith-based organizations, on good intending individuals working corporately, working in groups in order to solve some of those problems. And I wonder if there's a moral hazard there. Is it that we let the state off the hook, right, by stepping into that breach? And I'll just give one particular historical example. When George H.W. Bush, one of his State of the Union addresses, wanted to talk about, how does one solve social issues in the United States, he talked about the 1,000 points of light. And I can remember him putting his hands together in such a way that, and the argument was, of course, that, well, we've got all these great, faith-based institutions, among others, who can step into the breach, and they can feed the hungry and house the homeless, and that's a great solution. But of course, that went hand in hand with the idea that the state should be as small as possible, and that it's not active in that work. This is, of course, obviously, I have huge admiration for your work. So it's not an indictment about humanitarian work through NGOs, but I wonder how you think about that, and how you think about responsibility and where it lies.
Yeah. No, first of all, as you said, I come from a country, from the Netherlands, right? And when I left, we had a pretty good system in terms of, when people did not have a job or were sick, then, you could have access to support. And of course, there were cases that it was misused or it was not sufficient, but in principle, it was working. And 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 why was it working? Because everybody understood that you pay taxes, and those taxes will help to provide to people who have difficulties. And but what is very important when you have such a particular social system is that everybody understand how it works. So if you stop explaining how things work, then then you don't know, why am I paying tax, what is being used for, or if you have a society, a culture where it's not taught to you to work on your muscle, empathic muscle, then those whole systems becomes problematic, right? So I see that in a lot of the European countries as a result, because they wanted to imitate, the growth successes of the big brother country, the US. I mean, it's all have changed since I've left. So that's important to note. Now, when I came to US, what I admire is that there is a strong, you know, desire to make it. So if you put your, everything in it, then you will reach. And I think there is nothing wrong with that, but you also need to acknowledge that sometimes it doesn't work, and then people need to support. And there's nothing against the person that tried, but circumstances are there, and then you need to support each other. And so that is one thing that I see in the US. The other thing is, what is really magnificent is that people volunteering is part of what you do. And maybe it is changing a bit. I don't know the numbers, but I was flabbergasted by that. I mean, the fact that, Church World Service, for example, has the crop hunger walks, and through churches, they used to raise 15 to 70 million dollars for the work of Church World Service around the world, both inside as well as outside of the US. And we don't have something equivalent in the Netherlands, because I always jokingly said we don't have volunteerism because we don't mind paying tax.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the truth is a little bit in the middle there, right? So I think we could all learn from each other in terms of volunteerism, helping each other. It's a good thing to do. At the same time, there is nothing against the fact that, and I think it's necessary actually, that the state takes care of public goods, that takes care of its community, needs to ensure that persons can have good education. I mean, that's something else here. Education is not free, right? I mean, ultimately, if you want to, you go in depth when you. That's ridiculous. I mean, you look at all countries in Europe, education is free or practically free.
Mm-hmm.
So why can't you have that here as well? And if you don't, have these educational things going on, then it becomes the chances that you are creating groups that don't have access are increasing, and then you have a problem, which you clearly see. So if you ask me, what is your opinion? So I think NGOs should never, and that's never how I worked with Church World Service or NGOs that I've worked, has never tried to replace a government in any of the countries where we have worked. We always work together with the governments. We always work together with the local governments, but we also worked with the UN. So you need to work to ensure that you have the right policies. You need to ensure that you have the right plans. And so you are present as an NGO at different levels, at implementation, at the policy level, at strategies. And then you identify if there is a role for you to play. Mm-hmm. And in some situations, there is no role. And then you move somewhere else. And others there is, because NGOs should be about, working with those who are falling through the cracks. And, but very often, in the past, sure has happened, is that NGOs tend to work maybe in areas that are easily accessible, are not inclined to go to northwest Haiti. But they work closer to the capital city. So yeah, I mean, I think everybody should look into the mirror in terms of how can we make this work better in a better balanced way, and learn also from the different countries. I mean, but obviously the system that we have developed now is not sustainable, is not fair, is not just. And for faith-based organizations, for sure, that's be something that is unacceptable. But not to replace the government, but work together side by side, and that's important.
So I want to end up by coming back around to something you've mentioned already, but I wanted the inner development goals, because I
Mhm.
think that seems super important to you right now in achieving some of those wider goals that you have, the aspirations. But I want to do it in the context of your own practice of walking 100 miles a week. And you've done this since 2011 to raise awareness about hunger. And some of that has had to change around pandemic. That this practice has shifted a
Mhm.
little bit. But what I'm really interested in here, or what I want to give you the opportunity to do, is that you've really couched that as a part of the inner development goals, and that is sort of the next step forward, not replacing, but augmenting and being a way of thinking also about the sustainable development goals. So can you talk to us about your own practice and how this connects to these other frameworks?
No, I'm glad to. And actually, this year we are going to do it a little bit different than I've done so far, Chip. But so the 100-mile walk started when I was responsible for church world service in Indonesia, and then I had heard about these crop hunger walks in the US, right? That people would walk and raise a lot of money. So I said, when I'm based in the US, I want to give back, and I want to tell the world about all these volunteers in the US who are doing this amazing work. So you know what? I will walk from the east to the west coast because that's possible in the Netherlands. I didn't realize that it is more, challenging in the US. So my boss at that time said, you're not going to do that. You will be out for 3 months. So then I came up with 100-mile, which is doable in 5 to 7 days. So since 2012, I've been walking 100 miles to raise awareness and support for ending poverty and injustice. And there's all these years, it has really been a kind of an individual journey. Um, and and I've been so grateful for people who have supported that. So what I try to do in those 5 days that I walk for 7 days, meet with local food banks, with volunteers, and tell their stories to the world. Why? Because I come from the Netherlands, so I'm able to, and I've lived in Bangladesh and Indonesia. I'm able to tell the story to the world, well, not the whole world, but many, and to say thank you for all people that are helping to help others. And because I think that's really great, and it's also important for yourself. And when I walk, yes, I started talking about why am I doing this? What is the purpose? So and then it shifted right to kind of the inner development goals things in terms of yeah, I got to know about this, and it seems to kind of connect with this whole 100-mile thing, because it was not only a physical thing; it was also, it also emotional and thinking. All kinds of stuff was happening. But so walking the 100 miles is not really, of course, about the distance. It's what happens internally. So you face discomfort, doubt, sometimes even failure, but you keep on going. So I see this 100-mile now as both personal and collective practice for those inner capacities. And we're going to do this year a little bit differently, because my wife says because I really get injured every time. So then it takes me a week or so to recover. So she said, "You're not going to walk 100 miles anymore." So then I actually was forced into realize, but I should not be doing this alone anymore. Like I've started this podcast, right? Because during COVID, I was not able to walk with other people. So I started this virtual walk with people. Like the virtual walk in the podcast, I should also make this 100-mile walk more collective. So that's what we're going to do this year. So it's going to be a whole year campaign, which we call the 100-mile, where my colleague of JLI, Noor, will start walking in Islamabad. And he's responsible for 20 miles, and he will do that, I think, in 3 days. End of April, I will walk in New York City. I will do it in one day. And then some other colleagues will join, we hope, in one in Singapore. That's a community member, JLI community member, a colleague in Washington maybe, and help in Kenya. So we will have 4 or 5, hopefully more people who join this year the walk. And I think that's the right thing. I mean, now more than ever, we need to be shoulder and shoulder. The problems are too big to solve by yourself. You need to work as a community, as a group, as a collective. Now, I also saw that you had a question around the pandemic. Definitely it had an effect, not only on my walk. It also disrupted many other things. And for me, not only professionally, but also personally. So for me, one of the hardest moments was losing my mom during that time. And she was in the Netherlands. She she had light dementia as well. And I kind of kept an eye on her by camera, and the sound was not really working, so I only saw her. And through that little camera, I saw her also in her final moments through the screen without sound, and was not able to be there physically, and later also not for the funeral. And so even in the Netherlands, my family members there were not allowed, that was having to say goodbye at the parking spot. But that was, yeah, definitely. I mean, you talk about COVID, what was the impact? I mean, it was, enormous, right, on the whole world. It's something that we shared, that we realized we're all interconnected, because it's not only happening in, a country like Indonesia or, name it. No, this was happening to the whole world. And what I kind of, so it was tough at the moment. I also, so the beauty of it is that we realized that we interconnected. There was a kind of a solidarity, but it was very short lived, unfortunately.
Yeah.
As soon as certain people had access to vaccines, then they thought, I'm already fine, so why should I continue to be concerned about the rest? So that is really painful to see. But for me, it all made me realize how important connection is, and that drove me to continue with Walk Talk Listen as a podcast. And it started as a kind of replacement for the walk. Then I thought I will do this for a week or 2 or 3, and probably like your podcast, I'm at 300 plus episodes. Um, I don't know if it's useful for others, but it is absolutely useful for myself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that's kind of,
Yeah.
how it all connects.
So I want to be really mindful of your time. I know I've taken a lot of it already, but the last question I end up with, if you could entertain for us, is what am I not asking you about that you think I should be? What is in my myopia about, the work that you do? What is the thing that we haven't addressed yet?
I think we have addressed many things, but really what I would like to repeat is how I started, with what I started with in the beginning, and really to understand how we understand, re-looking at how we understand knowledge and success. So we often present polished results, what worked, what scaled, nice report, webinar afterwards maybe. But we rarely talk about what didn't work. So that's why, when last week I heard about this resume of failures, I think that whole idea is so powerful. Because I think if we are really serious about learning, and JLI is serious about learning, about mutual learning, ensuring that everybody or more people are at the table, then we also need to be honest about failure. I mean, the greats have talked about it, right? I mean, Einstein, if you've never made a mistake. I mean, I'm so bad in these quotes. That's why I did not study medicine, as you know. My memory is so bad. But so that, if there's something that I would like to give to your listeners is listen to your inner voice more often. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Ask questions. I'm repeating some of the stuff that my guests have said on my podcast, where I'm like, oh my god, this is so good. But it's part of learning, right? I mean, it's listening to the other and seeing how it relates to what you do and what you are about, and keep on growth. Growth is important, not in a sense of getting more money on your bank account. Growth is important in terms of continue to learn, be open to the other. And maybe something that I also try to say in my podcast is, and I've stolen this from a philosopher called Ken Wilber, and who says, nobody can be wrong 100% of the time. So that means that even, your worst enemy, there should be something that you can start to dialogue about. Now, I can name a couple of people that I will find it very difficult with, but I think we need to try, and then we can make the shifts that are necessary. I'm totally convinced about that. And what is encouraging, and you are the teacher, right? And you work with young people. I have also blessed that I have a very young team. It's so great to see that the younger generation, they are so darn smart, many of them. And they listen to them, um, and it doesn't mean that they need to do it. We need to play our role as long as we are here on earth. But it is encouraging to see that there is so much hope there. But we also can still provide those hope and contribute to it, and we should continue to do so.
Maurice Bloem, thank you so much for coming on Religion Wise. This has been great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
This has been Religion Wise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. Religion Wise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to Religion Wise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.